First of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Joe and Karen for supporting this work and making this incredible space available to be able to show it. It means a lot to me to be able to make a 9-foot piece and actually find a place to be able to put it. It's few and far between. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that the encroachment, which are the red and blue things over there, the dream waves and lamentation images, were projects supported through a grant through the National Endowment through the Art and a grant made by the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council. It would be really hard for me to devote the time to make experimental work without having some grants along the way. I have no idea if anybody's going to buy any of these, and I didn't know if I was going anywhere when I started messing around with this. It would also be really hard for me to spend weeks at a time kayaking on Lake Superior if it weren't for my wife, Honey, who's sitting over there by the window, taking care of our home and my Blacklock Gallery in Moose Lake. And speaking of support, I make a lot of my income from books, and we have the Light Waves book here at half price, and they're all signed. So do your part and give us some support. So on to the exhibit here. Like most abstract work, these images have both a visual and a metaphorical side to the work. And I'm going to start out talking about the visual aspects of the work. And that allows you to form your own impressions of what you see in these before I talk about what I was exploring with them. And we're going to start out with the Light Waves images, which are over here. These are just temporary display frames. And these are from the book, Light Waves, Abstract Photographs of Reflections on Lake Superior. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was kayaking around Lake Superior, photographing all around the lake, just making reflections in the waves. I wasn't trying to get perfect mirror reflections of what was there. I was working with the motion within the waves. So a century ago, Alfred Stieglitz turned his Graflex camera skyward, freeing the images of clouds from the contextualizing anchor of land, creating his equivalence series. And these were black and whites, and they became what was cited as the first abstract photographs. 40 years later, Win Bullock, who's one of my favorites, created his groundbreaking series, Colored Light Abstractions. And if any of you want to get a hold of an amazing little book, it's recently become available. And that book, the Colored Light Abstractions, has sweeping patterns reminiscent of Stieglitz's equivalence photographs, but they're imbued with intense colors. And Bullock's subject matter was light. And he had worked in a studio, and it was light transmitted, refracted, and reflected through fractured glass. He'd get a hold of some crystal glass with broken pieces and transmit the light through that. Absolutely beautiful work. With Light Waves, I'm creating a fusion of Stieglitz's equivalents, which are wind-driven patterns in nature. He's using clouds, I'm using waves on Lake Superior, and Bullock's use of light and color. By isolating the complex mirror of Lake Superior's surface, producing an abstract representation of the palette and the textures that are lying outside of the frame. And they build upon my Horizons book, which is isolating both sky and water. And despite their rather otherworldly appearances, the images were edited pretty much the same as I do with everything else. I pushed the contrast and the saturation a little bit, but otherwise they're pretty much left alone. One of the biggest challenges I had in doing the Light Waves was getting the right magnification. I wanted a fairly narrow angle of view and keeping everything in focus. The tighter you shoot something, the larger you make it, the harder it is to get in focus. And of course, normally your plane of focus is vertical like your camera plane, but the waves are at a 90-degree angle to that. So I tackled that by using a 135mm lens, this tilt-shift lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, which made it about 180mm, from my work from the kayak. And about half of these were done from my kayak. And then from land, I put my digital camera back on an old 4x5-inch view camera, a film camera, and the 300mm lens. And these setups allowed me to tilt the lens and change the plane of focus. So instead of being vertical, I could line up the plane of focus to follow the horizontal plane of the water. And that took care of the technical challenge of getting them in focus. Aesthetically, I was interested in how light accumulates during the length of the exposure. Light reflecting from moving water acts like a brush stroke. So the slower my shutter speed, the longer that brush stroke gets to be. The light became the paint, the waves, the brush, and the camera sensor, the canvas. The longer exposure creates these long, smooth brush strokes. A sixth of a second was the speed that I used most often. Times range from a full second, I'm looking for one on my gallery floor that's right there in my own gallery, up to a 3,000th of a second. When mastering the Lightwaves images, I used every Photoshop trick I knew to try to sharpen the edges of these shapes, but not get noise, and the two are kind of counter to each other. And I was really frustrated. I created an exhibition for these first at the Palm Beach Photographic Center's museum in Florida, and they were nice, but they weren't what I wanted them to be. And shortly after that, artificial intelligence software became available for sharpening images, enlarging them, and noise reduction. And that totally revolutionized what I could do and how I printed these. So these were all made using that software. Some of you know that my dad, Les Blacklock, was a nature photographer and a naturalist, and I grew up learning to see the world through a naturalist's eyes, understanding that humans are part of nature. And while we are extraordinary in many ways, we're not exempt from the laws of nature. And when we don't follow those laws, there are consequences for us and life on Earth. As a wilderness photographer, I'm seeing those effects all around Lake Superior. During the COVID lockdown, I, like many artists, had time to contemplate what I wanted to do and what I wanted to create once it was possible to get back out into the world. And I had already started revising my Lake Superior Images book, which was done back in 1993. It's landscapes from all around the lake. But the sense of disorientation that I was feeling both from the pandemic and from living in a world at the dawn of the Anthropocene epoch, a world that I barely recognized from my youth, created a need to do something different. By photographing reflections in Superior's waves, I continued to work with my lifelong subject, one that I understood well, but the images mirrored the Earth being out of balance, and that sense of disorientation that many of us feel each day. And yet I hope, despite their warnings, that these remain beautiful in many ways, that we can find refuge within the images. I think wherever we can find nature, we can find that sense of peace within them. The next series I worked on were the Dreamwaves images, which are those behind me here, and I'm including the two string theory pieces over here. So after the debut of the Lightwaves book and the exhibition down in Palm Beach, I began to experiment with the AI software, and I pushed it to find its limits, and I discovered that by taking it way beyond what it was designed to do, I could create some really interesting effects. And I spent many months playing with it, learning how to control those effects. So everything else that you see in this exhibit, other than Lightwaves and these two string theory pieces, were created using that AI software, and it came out of those experiments. And when I was doing the experiments, and to create these images, I take an original picture from Lightwaves, and I would enlarge it 200% using the AI software, which gets rid of the pixelization, and it sharpens things, and it keeps noise under control. It keeps creating new signal based on the original signal. So I'd crop a small area, I would enlarge it, I'd take it back into Photoshop, I'd do some adjustments there, sometimes increase texture, crop it again to a small area, take it back into the AI, enlarge it, and do that over and over again, sometimes 10 or 15 times, to get to these final pieces. And every time I'm in either Photoshop or the AI program, I'm adjusting different variables. And so what I'm working on here versus the ones on the other side of the wall, I'm just adjusting those variables in different ways to get different effects. One of the easiest ways I can explain the difference between the Lightwaves images and all of the rest of these is that the Lightwaves are similar to an acoustic guitar, and these are pretty straight. In an acoustic guitar, you're actually hearing the strings when somebody plays the guitar. These are Jimi Hendrix playing a Star-Spangled Banner. You're no longer hearing the strings. You're hearing the strings going through all of the electronics. You're hearing those electronic signals adjusted the way the artist wants to do it, and that's what I'm doing visually. The string theory 1 and 2 over here are outliers in that I didn't crop the images. They're based on the image over here of these orange, I call them squiggles for lack of a better name, which are sparkles on Lake Superior, very smooth swells up in Pakasan National Park at a half-second exposure made just before sunset. I'm using a very heavy neutral density filter to be able to shoot directly into the sun and not have it just burn out, and still use a slow shutter speed. So I took 2 or 3 images made from that same set of captures for each of these. I'm removing the black background, creating a color gradient, layering several images on top of each other with a multiply blend mode. If anybody uses Photoshop, you may know what that means. It means that as you add layers, it's darkening on top of it, the one that's beneath it, and it allows me to create things that, like you're looking through glass. So I wanted the effect of 3-dimensional glass objects being thrown up into the air. For the rest of the Dreamwave series, behind me here, I was striving to make images that had a variety of textures with long brush strokes and homogeneous hues, interrupted by contrasting colors and glitch art. Little areas that seem like your TV isn't quite tuned in quite right. So the images were edited in a stream of consciousness manner, keeping in mind the colors of Lake Superior and the precious gemstones and precious metals that are found in the surrounding bedrock. I created most of the Dreamwaves images towards the end of the pandemic, and people were attempting to escape the pandemic by going camping and into the wilderness, many of whom had absolutely no camping skills. And the kicker, of course, when they got there was that the campgrounds in the wilderness was overwhelmed with people. So I'm having a bit of fun with the AI in these images, using the glitches created by AI to not only represent people intruding to nature, but also the ubiquity of AI. Just like the crowds, there is no longer any place we can escape AI. So I'm going to switch over to the other side of the